Go.
So we left off just about on the verge of one of your greatest successes, Battlestar Galactica in 1978. Can you tell us how that project came about?
One of the first projects that I attempted to take to Universal, to a guy in business affairs who took a liking to me, was a project called Adam's Ark. And my concept was there was a Time magazine cover, I think, of everyone who had ever been on Time magazine's cover. They tried to have a birthday party or something. This is a long time ago now. And I mean, it would have had everybody on there. It would have had from astronauts to sports stars to scientists. It was really if you knew that you had D-Day approaching or a nuclear disaster approaching, and my premise was that Howard Hughes's computers have predicted that the end of the world as we know it within a finite period of time, and these people were all invited for this cover party at this massive something in the edge of the desert in Nevada. And this is at a time when Howard Hughes was not, nobody knew where he was, supposedly up in that suite on the top floor. And Mayhew and all these people, very few people. I interviewed a guy later. He said he only saw him 3 times in 20 years he worked for him. Once was on a railway exchange car when he was on his way into Vegas. So, but he was also the dean of aviation and science and all of those things. So I thought it made some sense. So he invited all these people, and at some point they hear this kind of rumble and whatever, and someone makes it up to like the bridge, and they realize that they're in the air, that this massive modern building has taken off and is carrying off into the universe the creme de la creme of the world's most brilliant people. And the idea is that this is going to be a journey. And Star Trek did not start off as the darling of the broadcasting world. When I was still in the preps and living out in Sierra Madre and just barely married and whatever, and I remember watching a couple episodes of Star Trek, and the first season was fairly fragile. And Gene Coon came in, I think, the second season, and they did some of their more distinguished works with Harlan Ellison and a few others, especially Dean, by the way. He was a real student of humanity, and so he'd bring some really core values into a lot of these episodes. They weren't just Monster of the Week and so forth and so on. So that show went off the air, I think, at the end of the 3rd season or something, and the networks were not clamoring for the next science fiction show. A few years later, Star Wars comes along, and every network desk has scripts on it. It now has The Day the Earth Stood Still, War of the Worlds. All of these things are on desks. And I wanted to do my space journey, but instead of starting from Earth, I had become a big fan of a couple of books. One was, I'm trying to remember now. I'll think about it. I'll remember the books. But they all dealt with the potential of contamination here on this planet from other worlds. And today we're getting much closer to the philosophy of some of these theories that perhaps rocks that came here from Mars had bacteria on them, and from that bacteria we evolved eventually over billions of years and whatever and ever. And so I love the idea of going all the way back out in space and bringing the remnants of that world and trying to find Earth. It was like reversing the thing, and the battles and things that they would meet on the way. And many of the concepts that I was playing with are are sort of being revisited now. And I know what one of them was. I think it was von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. And Hancock's written what's called Fingerprints of the Gods. And a couple of our episodes were even, various things of the gods and something out in space. So my premise was simple, and again, it's like if you take something to a network, says, can we put a Mercedes grill on it, or this or that. I thought we had a pretty good premise, because when you really examine it, nobody really knows who, to a finite fact, who or how they built the pyramids. They certainly have never solved the problem of, unless we have some anti-gravity device or something. You build a thing to get up to the top, but how do you build that? There's so many loose ends. The technology and the science of the stars, that ancient civilizations like the Mayans and the Toltecs and the Egyptians they still don't know what was the mother civilization that spawned these technologies. An Aztec calendar that is still plus or minus a few seconds after thousands of years, and which, by the way, I think predicts we all end in 2012 or something, would be the end of the next big epoch. So I really love the mythology and the theology of, there are those who believe that life here may have begun out there beyond the stars, where even now humans fight for their survival. That was the premise. It's fairly simple. One of the most successful shows in the history of television was Wagon Train, and it's just about the journey. Once in a while, their scout would go ahead and get into some trouble in the next town, or try to ferret out some, whatever. But I thought that was a very simple concept, fairly well proven to be one in which you can do human values, and it could be a successful show. Our platform was good. John Dykstra being available to help us, and Fox making Industrial Light and Magic available to us, along with many other things. It was just a dream come true that we could put this together.
Let me stop you, though, and go back a little bit.
Sure.
You'd done so many cop shows, or cop-themed shows, and two Westerns. You had no, at that time, science fiction experience. Was this a chancy thing for you to... Was this an idea that you came up with and went to the network and said, I want to do a science fiction show? Or did the network come to you and say, Glenn, you've been so successful for us, could you come up with a science fiction show for us?
No, Adam's Ark was a show I had tried to sell to Universal. And it was very simple. There were no takers. There was nobody interested in science fiction. When something blossoms in the marketplace, it changes, every head turns. Mm-hmm. The networks were now interested in science fiction.
So you went to them and said, I've got this idea?
Well, I was in constant business with them and talking this idea or that idea. And that idea was, it's like on a couple of pages of exactly how I would take and do Wagon Train heading towards Earth. And combine it with some of the... No one knows I later had a long, long series of meetings with Isaac Asimov, going over all of my concepts, and some he liked and some he didn't. And he was going to be involved in the second season. And we had a whole Bible put together for that. But yes, it started with going to them, and it wasn't like just a slam dunk. We had to do a lot of work to get that launched, but there was clearly an appetite once again for science fiction. Obviously, Mr. Lucas gets great credit for launching that genre back into the public eye, because for a long time nobody was making any kind of science fiction.
And when you were coming up with this idea of Wagon Train and other civilizations and their impact on Earth, you took a pretty bold risk in starting your show. Your concept was such a disaster, with an entire human race being wiped out. Was that a troublesome concept to get sold to the network, to start on such a tragedy?
No, not really. It's Pearl Harbor. It was that's probably the simplest thing of all, is that you surprise attack. It's the Trojan horse. It's whatever. In fact, we use the Trojan horse pretty much in Buck Rogers. But no, the idea that you make a mistake. A mistake on those levels of industrial or military power, we could never endure another Pearl Harbor. Whatever happens, if it's a real frontal assault from anybody with today's weaponry, it's a wipeout. This is a different era. And we're talking about people who are advanced technologically way, way, way beyond us. Star Trek has dealt with lots of those different kind of pulse weaponry and this system of transport and whatever. But people are pretty naive about. We thought 9/11 was pretty devastating. That's a drop in the bucket to what could happen. That's why so many people argue the preventive military actions today, because we could never endure another surprise attack like that one, because it would not be on that scale. It could be so devastating that we'd never survive it. So Battlestar is not a reach. It's a very simple. It's a very simple thing. They weren't prepared. They thought they had a treaty. It was fine, and then suddenly betrayal, and they got to run like hell.
Why did you opt for Cylons and not the standard aliens from another planet?
Well, we actually do have an alien being in there, but one of our biggest problems in Battlestar was time and costs. It's television doesn't have quite the budget that features it, and we were way ahead of CGI. CGI makes things possible today that when we were doing this show were just awfully ambitious. The mistake was not in making several 2-hour shows a year rather than trying to do a weekly show, because the burden on, every time you do a single ship, you have to make 7 or 10 passes on an optical printer. It's impossible. It's so expensive. So you get criticized if you repeat a shot or something like that. It was very ambitious, and to the extent that we could hold the line, and they were pretty supportive, but it was more expensive than anyone could afford.
Let's step back a little bit to the initial conception still. Battlestar Galactica. The name, Battlestar Galactica, how did that come about?
We actually put together probably 200 names from almost everybody on the lot, and we're sending them around to see what people liked. We obviously Galactica is now so common in science fiction and throughout it. I mean, I've been doing a lot of reading recently, and it probably the nickname of the show is really Galactica. That's what everyone uses, but it's about a battleship, a surviving battleship, and you could say starship, you could say Battlestar. We came up with that title to sort of give it a spin that was both commercial and told the story. It's the last surviving warship that could help guide this wagon train.
You made some conceptual decisions at the beginning, I guess, in the way the characters dressed, the language they used, that were pretty unique for television at the time.
Well, my feelings were that if you took the Egyptian culture as sort of a role model, and we took that design, our coins and everything had pyramids on them, and the uniforms all bear the strong influence of Egyptian, that Mideast culture, because that's where the scientific advances were on our planet, and I figured it made some sense. We actually shot some stuff in Egypt, on the show. Mm-hmm. And my thought was that if we're going to be a galaxy thousands of light years, maybe millions, away from here, and in a time frame I never wanted to lock into. When Admiral Perry sailed into Japan, he didn't find people walking around wearing Brooks Brothers suits and ties, and I went crazy trying to avoid the red fire extinguisher on the wall or the push broom that looks exactly like the one we got at Home Depot. Even silverware and eating utensils and the look of food. We spent so much time trying to avoid anachronisms that are just, to me, representative of lazy or sloppy writing. We tried very hard. I'm sure we didn't succeed all the time, but even when it came to slang, and I know you'll probably bring it up because one of the wire services called a few weeks ago. He says, okay, so you made up the word frack. Well, we were trying hard not to use common terminology that you'd hear in Burbank or up in, what's the town up in Canada where everything is shot?
Vancouver.
Vancouver. You know, it just drives me a little crazy that you're just, I'm out of here, or, you know, whatever, that everything sounds exactly like Dawson's Creek in space.
But what you did with frack, though, was beyond that. You were able to push the limits of censorship. Let's all cover your ears and home a little bit.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's obviously fuck, and they use it that way, and yet the censors, even though that word is a placeholder for that profanity, they let it go. How did you manage that, and how did you think you could get away with it?
Well, I mean, how many times has one of my favorites, George Carlin, said, you said shoot, mother, but you meant shit. We all know you meant shit. You said shoot. So, I mean, you know, to paraphrase, and Felgercarb was obviously bullshit.
Right.
It was an attempt to try to create an environment which didn't smell like Burbank and had some uniqueness to it. And, you know, I was toying with all of the things that were right on the edge, you know, people who are just absolutely slaves to their daily horoscopes. You know, our planets are, you know, Caprica and Sagittaria and so forth and so on. What if these things started out there and made their way here? I mean, that's the philosophy. That's the theology. And, you know, to the extent that we succeeded in that it found an audience, and it has had an incarnation of sorts, and with a wholly new fan base, some of which is in total conflict with the old one. And I have a lot of pride in the fact that we created something that lasted more than 13 episodes and that does seem to have some kinds of legs attached to it, that will bear a feature in the not too distant future. So I'm proud of that.
But going back to what you take so casually but has such a big impact, frack and Feldercarb, the censors never said, Glenn, we know you mean bullshit here. We know you mean fuck. You're not fooling us. You can't use these words that way. You were pushing an envelope that hadn't been pushed on TV before.
I'd hate to think that, not to marginalize a career,
Right.
but that the upside of my career comes down that I got away with the word frack. This would be a little bit disappointing to me. You know, it was one of thousands of decisions that were made in putting that machine up in space and surrounding it with as many of the realities we could deal with at that point. That's a show that should have had a chance to grow within the improvements that would come along and help it to do better and better, as has been Star Trek has benefited from the fact that it's become easier to do all the things they wanted to do. It was tough in that first season when, every week you're on a soundstage with a different colored rock. That's not fun, and it's very hard to. This is where radio was easier. Dimension X and 2000 plus, your mind could build all those things for you.
Well, let's get back to
Our intentions were good.
to making Battlestar. Clearly, it was hugely expensive. Did you have a pilot commitment, or was it a 13 episode or 22 episode commitment right off the bat to amortize that cost?
I think we had to make the pilot. I'm remembering now the wounds, the lash marks of trying to get that budget down to a television movie budget. It was tough. It was very tough. We envisioned almost a series of movies at first. I think when they decided to go on an episodic basis, it was, first of all, there's the joy of making the sale. That's always there. You say, well, I'll worry about making it later, but you do eventually have to get around to that. And I don't recall the business deal now on that exactly. My biggest burden was getting past the pilot. Then we had to deal with the budgets. We had to submit a lot of storylines and where we would go with future episodes. My recall dwells more on the problems of what stories are we going to tell than with what they were going to cost at that point.
So, casting the pilot. Tell me about that. How you came to cast Lauren Green and Richard Hatch and Dirk Benedict.
Dirk is someone I had met in New York, and I just thought he had a lot of style, sex appeal. I liked him right away. Richard came to me by way of the network. I think it's soap operas and some movies of the week and things that they had done. I liked him right away. Lauren was sort of a natural. I mean, is the idea if you could take Lauren Green, who was the there's two ways to go. Totally unknown, or if you were offered a guy who was instrumental in one of the longest-lasting family westerns, and in many ways a space show is a western. Lauren Green was I guess one of those people you really couldn't say no to. It just made a lot of sense. Because one of the things that you deal with in science fiction, and one of the reasons it was hard to sell, is that it always enjoyed a very small niche audience. It did not have, more and more of people who are here today who could look at this tape or other things have grown up with space. But going back to the origins of Star Trek, we hadn't grown up with space, nor NASA, nor all of the things we've accomplished and learned. All of that, none of that was around. So a lot of people just didn't care. It didn't have relevance, and especially women. Maybe boys liked rockets, but women weren't too crazy about them. And so the idea that a show like Bonanza was able to capture a huge Sunday night audience for that length of time, and I think Lauren was a blessing too. He was very good at sitting down and really talking about stories and people and those kinds of values.
You considered Don Johnson, at least that's the rumor.
No, we tested Don. There are two good Don Johnson stories, but that was the first one because I met Don, I think, testing for that show, and it really was because he had a bucolic, a very kind of a country twang. I think he would have been great in the show. I was trying so hard to keep from the anachronisms. Someone with a real yawl, and it just seemed to me that we wouldn't find that millions of light years away. Very unlikely. Mm-hmm. So, it was trying to keep a purity, whether it worked or not. But I like Don very much. I later tested him along with 5 other guys for another role, and the network said they didn't like anybody that I had tested. And one of them was Don, and the other one was Mr. Hasselhoff. So
What was this for?
that was for Knight Rider.
Oh. So, Terry Carter, you brought in from McLeod.
Yeah, I liked Terry. I thought Terry had a very straight presentation that did not smack of any zone, any specific area of the country. They just talk about they never wanted announcers to have accents in radio or television, and they were sort of indigenous to nowhere, just straight American. I didn't want these voices to be polarized to any one area or anything to distract from the fact they're in another galaxy.
Your central prop, I guess, the Battlestar Galactica itself, was unusual for space shows at the time. It wasn't a smooth, sleek starship. It had a gritty, ratty, more industrial look. Was that something you had decided to do, or was that John Dykstra?
No, there was a combination of things. I sat down and tried to articulate what I wanted. I wanted it to be an aircraft carrier in space. That's what you have, those large bays with the ships that could fly in and out and so forth. And John Dykstra had the greatest model makers in the world, and Ralph McQuarrie is a great artist. And Ralph came aboard and drew all kinds of great things to give us choices, which way we would go. And it didn't take long to arrive at the Battlestar. It was terrific.
What was your budget for this show? I mean, you had John Dykstra, you had Ralph McQuarrie, you had these amazing sets.
Today, I have no idea what it was. I just can't remember. I can't remember the first budget on It Takes a Thief either, but I know it was under $200,000, and they probably spend that on craft services now on an hour episode of anything. It's just, the way it is. It was enormous, and but it was an undertaking everybody wanted to a part of. So it, But we cut a lot of corners. There are a lot of things that we would like to have done that we couldn't do.
And you talked earlier about the theme, the very big, powerful orchestral theme.
Yeah, I sat down with Julie. And I knew what I wanted for that, and boy, there's some great recordings of that. London Philharmonic, things like that. There's so many great. One of the greatest thrills was go to the Boston Pops and have John Williams play all of his great themes. And then he plays Galactica, Battlestar Galactica, and it got a huge ovation. And they used it to close the Hollywood Bowl 4th of July thing with the fireworks. Those kind of things mean a lot. Those are moments that you don't buy, you don't anticipate them happening, but when they work great. And John Williams stood on the stage at the time Stu was conducting the orchestra at the Fox, big soundstage, theater, movies scoring stage.
Talk a little about the writing of the show. Obviously, you didn't want to do Star Trek over again, and you hadn't had a lot of science fiction experience. What was your storytelling?
I think that's an advantage because we're not trying to tell something that's been told before. We're really trying to deal with the possible migration of humans across the universe in this direction, and you shouldn't be limited by whether or not you're running into all these different aliens and so forth and so on. And one of the problems with that is how hard it is to pull that off. We always figured we would get to more of that later, but every week it comes so fast. If you had a year to produce every episode, it would have been too short.
Your writing staff was Donald Belisario, Frank Lupo.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time at home writing on that show. Don did a great job on that show. We had a huge argument on that show over one issue that most people wouldn't even have spent any time attention to. But I always wanted to keep it open whether or not this is in the past or the future Earth time. I mean, we could have gotten to this planet and found it covered with dinosaurs. He wanted to put that one soundbite in, one small step for man, from the landing on the moon. And my feeling was that it dated us. He was so determined and he felt so strongly about it. I finally gave in, and I figured, if something's bouncing around out in space, you could always adjust the time warp thing to still be future or past, and because that's done so often in science fiction now that we have so much more exposure in science fiction than we did back then. It's just multiplied, 1,000-fold.
Now we have to mention, obviously, there's a dispute with Fox on Star Wars.
Well, there's no question that everything is influenced by something else, and if not in starting out, in execution, there's always things. But I had a meeting with the producer of Star Wars, who did not do the subsequent things, but we made an agreement that we would not do certain things. One was laser fire out of the guns, and we never did, and a number of other things that we would do to keep them apart. It still wound up going to court, and it came out satisfactory. But it was a huge imposition of time to have to go and spend days and in depositions and things of that sort.
Why didn't the series go beyond the original version of Battlestar Galactica? Go beyond its first season? What spelled its
money?
demise?
Really, money, and they were disappointed that it wound up, I think, number 16 out of the top 40 shows that season. But it started off in the top 5, and you're going to get a big tune-in to start with. They had another show on the air that they thought, gee, look how well this is doing on Tuesday night. Let's move it to Sunday night. And it almost destroyed the ABC schedule. They moved Mork and Mindy into Battlestar's time slot. It didn't do even the same numbers Battlestar did, or comparable, or the same. And it destroyed their Tuesday night, and they had to go back and rebuild and do the whole thing over. We were good friends with ABC at the time, so it wasn't like there was any animus. They just made what they thought was a sound business decision. You could produce Mork and Mindy on a stage for nothing, and here you've got a show that's costing just well over $1 million, whatever. By today's standards, it's nothing. But at that time, it was exorbitant. And it's one of those things that if I could do it over, if there were ways I could reorganize how we did it and what we could try to accomplish and change the scale of it. Things are done so differently today in television. If you look at The Sopranos. I mean, they decide they're not going to come on the air for 6 months or something, or they're going to do this, or look at 24. Any of these, they don't adhere to that frantic, rigid time schedule that we were then. I mean, you had to be on the air or else. I mean, you couldn't stop and take time out, and we did a number of 2-hour episodes. So the rules have changed a lot. I wish we could have changed them at that time. But money was the biggest factor. But in truth, the numbers were not as high at the end of the year as they had been in the front. And it's a numbers game. If you're delivering, everybody we had wanted, they probably would have bitten the bullet. They did say they made a mistake and come back and want to do another incarnation, but it wasn't the same show with the same.
So they had they had regretted they canceled it and came back to you and said, "Is there a way to bring it back cheaper?" And you came up with Galactica in 1980.
Yeah, and I've had mixed emotions about wanting to do that, whether we should have. I think one of the best episodes we made in all of them was done on that. The very last one, the Starbuck episode, where we went back and said, "I don't care, we're done anyway, so I'm going to do an episode I always wanted to do," where Starbuck finds himself crash on a planet with a Cylon, and the two bond and have, you know, they talked about doing that as a play on the West End in London, and you know, sometimes you write one for yourself and you say, you know, if I could do it, I'd do a lot of them like this. This would be great. Didn't require a lot of special effects and things. What we had what we needed, and it was a great story.
While we're on the subject of Battlestar, let's jump ahead and talk about its later incarnations. You also tried to bring it back before the current version on the Sci-Fi Channel. Didn't you try to mount a movie or another television version?
No, I own the movie rights.
Mm-hmm.
Brian Singer and came to me and said he'd like to do somewhat akin to what the current group at Universal have done. And they asked if I would get involved. So I sat in on some meetings with them and looked at drawings, and we talked and so forth and so on. And then Brian got an ultimatum where he had to go rushing off to do X-Men 2, or they were going to take it away from him. And he made a choice that he wanted to do. He at that point was not talking about a feature. He was talking about a major television event, and then whatever would happen. And I participated in some of those meetings and talked about that. When they went to the Sci-Fi Channel, they just simply went off and did it. And they had the television rights and the rights to do that. They did not decide to stick to the same theology or mythology, and in fact in print quite often said there is no Earth. It's just a myth we're putting out there to focus. It's a rabbit in front of the fleet, and a number of other things, and people walking around wearing Brooks Brothers suits and ties and so forth and so on. I considered some of it what I would call lazy writing. Not people stories, not the soul stories where people are interacting and you have some genuine human emotion and so forth. I think that's all fine. But I found myself in the middle, not wanting to sell out all of the things that I really believe were important and could still have been respected, because so many things have been brought back that they said they weren't going to. I mean, we talk about my favorite characters in the entire thing was Lloyd Bridges, Commander Kane, and the Pegasus. I just simply shifting roles around so that Starbuck's a woman and as is Kane and so forth and so on. I think it's stepping on a concept in ways you don't need to. It certainly complicates telling a feature because you're walking through a minefield of changes and you're trying to figure out what do you do now. I think they could have respected a lot more of those values without losing the ones they wanted to go for. And there's a large fan base out there that likes the show. And I have to be pleased that something created that many years ago has found a niche and an audience. You see one of the cast shots up there on the wall next to some of the original shots. I respect what they've tried to do. I personally don't like to see it look like it's Burbank or people are using current contemporary slang and things that just, to me, are anachronistic and make it more difficult to buy on a different level. But that's my opinion, and I'd rather they had chosen a vehicle entirely of their own to play with, and I think the Writers Guild really was not respecting their franchise when they got into the business to protect credits and to protect people from having a studio just decide, okay, you get the written by on this one and that one. We have a credit structure that's pretty strict, and you have to work pretty hard to get created by. And the Writers Guild owned magazine puts out a cover picture of, I guess it's Ron Moore, he's creator of Battlestar Galactica. Well, that's absolutely just not factual. It's not true. And I arbitrated the script and was awarded full, half written by without sitting down to write a word, because so much has been lifted and borrowed, extrapolated, whatever, from the original. Um, I say all this with the kind of joy in my heart that comes from being considering myself one of the luckiest people to ever walk down the pike. And that doesn't mean there's not a lot of hard work involved. It's just that so many things I wanted to do, I got to do. And I really believe that that's one of the greatest things about this business we're in, is that you can take chances. You can, hey, if you miss, you miss, but you love to go down by your own sword. I mean, where you really took the risk and you had the chance to do what you wanted to do, that they don't take it away from you. It's a big difference between movies and television. Television, you really are usually given the chance to fail on your own, where in movies, the committees and the time it takes and the amount of time that goes by and the number of writers they throw at a project, much more difficult business to feel joy and satisfaction. And I have nothing but satisfaction for, how could I not, we're in a room in which there are so many people on these walls that, I would have just loved to walked up and asked for their autograph. Richard Burton has done episodes, and the fact that Fred Astaire came in and did that wonderful Battlestar. You know why he did that episode? Because his grandkids loved the show. he wanted them to appreciate him then, and so he went on and did the show, and he was great. Belisari wrote that episode. And so,
how do you feel about the far darker, grittier, more sexual approach to Battlestar in the new version?
Well, if you wanted to get a good meeting any place in town on any project, you just go in and say darker, grittier, sexier, and whatever. There's a tone and a coloration that is in now, and it affects me in the. We have a Knight Rider feature product out there, and every other memo I get is darker, grittier. It's just what is. I don't have problems with toning, and with that, I mean, look at the Batman series of movies. You got 3 of them that are done in one sort of tongue-in-cheek one way, and then the last one comes along, and there's lines blocks long for the Dark Knight, and it's darker and it's changed, so that you can go through these different things. I don't like changing the cornerstones, the mythology. I mean, I don't like saying the Cylons were created by humans, because that was not the premise.
How did you feel about them scrapping the iconic theme?
I feel badly every time they change anything that is generic. I feel badly when Knight Rider doesn't use the theme, because it spawned like 3 or 4 hit rap records. They own it. Why deviate? Why change something that is a comfort zone?
You mentioned before Ron Moore, taking credit for creating it. It seems
well, I didn't say that he took credit.
The Writers Guild magazine.
Maybe the Writers Guild gave it to him on their cover. I personally would not stand up if I were doing Star Trek and claim to be the creator of it in place of Gene Roddenberry.
Why do you think they aren't giving you the credit for it the way they give Roddenberry the credit for Star Trek?
I have no idea. We are in negotiation right now in the feature with Universal, and they're nothing but flattering and kind, and hopefully it's a go project, and it's going to be good. But I mean, it's anytime you re-embark on something like this, it's an enormous challenge. How to keep everybody happy, and maybe you don't. Maybe Batman's the clue. You don't try to stick to whatever was.
Now, finally, just to end the Battlestar discussion, you've had other shows that were 22 or 13 and out. Battlestar was a one-season show. Are you astonished that people were interested in bringing it back and remaking it, as opposed to, say, Sword of Justice or another one of your one-season shows?
No, because it was one of the only ones I felt remorse for that it got away prematurely. Look, I have 9 children, and people will ask you, do you? I mean, rather foolishly probably, but do you have a favorite child? Or, you know, if you have the runt of the litter or something in a group of puppies or something, does your heart go out to that one most? I was vested in Battlestar emotionally. I really loved the thematic things, and I don't feel it really got its shot, and I can't say I got to blame everyone else. You know, I'm right at the center of that, but circumstances weren't in our favor to be able to make it either cheaper. Now, had we had CGI, had we had some of the tools today, or had we insisted that we just make 2 or 3 2-hour movies, you know, and get our sea legs and then break off a year later, as we did, like with you brought up Quincy. Mm-hmm. Quincy was in the mystery movie for a couple of years before it went to series. Perfect. Then it ran 8 years. That was probably the smart way to go, but we didn't know it at the time. We couldn't see the forest for the trees.
But that was just your first science fiction show. You followed up with Buck Rogers. Was that a pilot and then a theatrical film, or a theatrical film then a pilot? What was the genesis of Buck Rogers?
It was a 2-hour movie. They had a script that they didn't like at Universal, and they asked if I'd take a shot at it. I wrote a new script with Leslie Stevens. Again, these characters come back in your life, and we had a wonderful time on that. We made a picture that was more than a television movie. And the minute they saw, Dan Hallard directed, but he also is a former art director. And I mean, he did brilliant scenes. And they looked at it and said, we got to release this as a feature. So they went to NBC and made a deal. NBC would get it first and then have first option as a series. And it was released theatrically because the studio wanted to give it a shot.
But it was pitched initially as a pilot. It was
a pilot. It was totally a television show.
And then was it the theatrical success that prompted NBC to buy the series, or the ratings when it finally aired?
No, it did fine. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it opened decently, and it was well received. I mean, if it was a bomb, NBC would probably not have gone near it, but they did. They wanted to pick it up as a series, and interestingly enough, they brought in the guy who had done Gunsmoke for
John Manley.
1,000 years in television, probably one of the longest running television shows ever. And they brought him in to do the episodes, which pleased me no end, because doing science fiction is not easy, and I was fairly well worn out at that point, and I was thrilled to see someone, because I knew he'd come in and tell some good stories. At least that was my hope.
Now, William Conrad did the opening narration for Buck Rogers, and from that point on, he would be in other of your shows doing narration. Talk a teeny bit about your relationship with William Conrad.
Bill just became a good friend. He's one of the he was the original Matt Dillon in radio, and I told you how much I loved radio. He was Matt Dillon. Now, he didn't quite fit the look for the series lead. He didn't quite have Jim Arness's sex appeal, but you still hear it on XM radio when they do all the old radio shows. I love listening to his voice because he has one of the greatest voices in the world. So he became the voice of our company. He did the voice at a wedding of mine. This has been a Glen Larson production. He was once the head of production at Warner Brothers. I mean, he is really a multifaceted guy, and I brought him in to do everything I could where I could.
What was your relationship like with Gil Gerard? How'd you find him, of all people, to be the star of Buck Rogers?
You know, that's one of those things where usually you have all these meetings and things where you subject actors to this horror of a room with 18 people sitting there and agents and all kinds of people. And with Gil Gerard, I had just run into him once at some party, I think at Universal, and said he'll be Buck Rogers, and no one ever called back and questioned it. Mm-hmm. Never had a meeting on it. He was just going to be Buck Rogers, and Boy, I wish they were all like that. But that was
Now, Aaron Gray had been bouncing around the universe a lot on countless pilots and things at the time. Was that someone you had cast, or that Universal asked you to
no,
put
no.
in the show?
I cast her. I don't. She hadn't been bouncing around in my hemisphere. I don't know where she came from, but I liked her very much. I thought she was terrific. I sat down personally with Mel Blanc to say, I want you to do this robot thing. Of course, I've been a fan of Mel Blanc's my whole life. Yeah, I go back to Jack Benny radio show, you know, from playing the car to the guy who guards the vault to everything. But he says, I want something sort of like a bitty, 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 bitty. He says, that's what we'll do, bitty, 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 bitty. And we actually came up with it at lunch at La Serre. And he became the voice of Tweaky.
It must have been such a thrill for you to work with both William Conrad and Mel Blanc on that show from your childhood.
Yeah, yes. Yes, what can you say? If I say it's all fun, you know, I have probably the distinction of only a few people, because not too many people have been in a position to fail on the scale I have. But I had 3 shows canceled in the same phone call twice
Were those
in my
situations?
career. I mean, now you have to reach out and work awful hard to get in that position to where you could have that kind of a bad day.
What were the 3 shows in that?
Well, I'll remember the last one because they canceled Battlestar, the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, and the pilot development of Magnum PI at ABC in one phone call from Brandon Stoddard.
Now, how were you able, with so many shows on the air, to keep your hands on all of them? I mean, at this point, where you're joking about it, 3 shows canceled at once, but at the same time you had 3 others going and several others in development. How are you able to not just run your sort of mini studio within a studio, but also continue being a writer-producer on these shows?
I'm an alien. No, it's all done with mirrors. It's just smoke and.
Was there did you have a delegation philosophy on what work you gave others, or a special way of managing your time, or a priority system?
Well, you do try to hire some good people to be on your shows. That goes without saying. I was very successful at getting people like Frank Lupo, and who went on to their own full careers. Michael Gleason was terrific. So we. The bigger problem comes when you get too many episodes or too many of anything, and then you're not going to be able to sit and do those or develop new shows. I did like doing that. That almost cost me the best star to come along the pike for almost anybody in many years, and we'll get to that. But because he said, well, he's not going to stick around. He'll go off and do something else. But hell, I told you on a couple of occasions, at least I was invited to leave. So I said, don't worry about it. You'll be disgusted with me in a few weeks. I'll be gone.
But did you have a formula when you create a show where you knew, okay, I'll be writing the pilot, I might write the first or second episode, but I can't be in the room cracking stories?
No. I tried to stay with things till I thought that they were on their feet, that they had learned to walk and talk. And there is no one kind of timing on these. It's all perseverance. It's sort of, I have one philosophy that is absolutely imperative, and that's if you believe in something, you must will it through, because everything gets in the way. Everyone tries to steer the ship off course, and it's misdirection, and you must be focused, and sometimes that can get you a reputation, and I can think of other people who have much stronger reputations than I, but for being so autocratic and unopen to suggestion. But you really have to pretty well pick a course and follow it. You can't do too much.
During this period, though, did you see yourself as a writer first? Was that where you got the most pleasure from all these shows?
If I had to be thankful for one, we'll call it talent. I mean, I never like to assume that's a very strong word, but let's say the ability to put elements together that work. I would say I'm most grateful to writing, because writing, especially in television, but I think it's true movies too, to a large extent. Television is totally dominated and driven by the writer. The writer is everything in TV. There's no time for anyone else to screw around with it. It's the writers. And that, if you can write, it will lead to control. And control really leads to satisfaction because you get to see your dream fulfilled as opposed to just mismanaged, damaged, misinterpreted, whatever. I mean, that's what we talk about when we talk about Battlestar or anything else. Once you lose a grip on it, it can go in so many different ways. Not all bad, and maybe none bad in some cases. We'll get to one of my favorite shows in which I can take very little credit beyond a certain point, but picking the right people is terribly important. If you get the right cast and the right people on the show, boy, you can take it easy.
During this period when you're doing so many shows, though, you're also doing, and we're not touching on each one, but pilots that didn't go. Was there ever a point where you said,
"How dare you bring that up?"
Were there points where you said, "No, I'm too busy with this show to be developing other shows," or were you eager to just keep expanding and taking every opportunity that came along?
I don't remember, being flooded with other things. I mean, people, first of all, if you're in an organization, they know what you're doing, and they're pretty protective of your not getting spread too thin, unless they have a devious agenda to get rid of you.
We can come back.
No, I mean, I always liked the challenge of something new and interesting. I told you I was not crazy about the idea of going back and doing hour episodes on whatever it was at the time. It's just that's tough because I never did movies of the week. I would never do one because the exact same amount of effort and time that goes into a movie of the week, you've done a pilot which you could run for 8 years. So why bother with the other? And so mostly I didn't do those in my entire career.
Should we stop here?